You know, according to the story, this game takes place underground on Jupiter. I'm not an astrophysicist, but I'm pretty sure hydrogen gas can't form maze-like labyrinths. Okay, so I'm fairly certain most of you know that dungeon crawls tend to be really difficult. Or sometimes they start easy enough, but then the difficulty ramps up before you even get a quarter way through. Well, today's ancient DOS game, Reaping the Dungeon, also known as Dungeon Rogue, well, it has a reversed difficulty curve, meaning it starts really hard, but gets really easy by the time you get to the end of the game. While under normal circumstances this would make a game less enjoyable, this particular game has enough features trickled in as you progress that at least it never gets boring. And there is something to be said about feeling practically invulnerable the closer you get to the end of the game. You can still screw everything up though if you're not careful, but before we get into too many details, let's take a look at those game stats. Reaping the Dungeon was created and released by Ron Heuse under his Frontline Software banner in 1993 and is a one-player dungeon crawl. The game actually switches between two video modes as you play, an 80 by 25 16-color text mode with a heavily modified character set for most of the gameplay, and then anytime you pull up the map screen, it switches to a VGA 640 by 480 16-color mode. It only supports the PC speaker for sound effects, and as for its current release date, well, this is where it gets a little interesting. The full version of Reaping the Dungeon is now free to obtain, but it has to be done in a very specific way. To get a legal copy of this game, you have to post a link to Ron Hughes' website on your own website, then simply send him an email to get your free copy. And there's a few more details about this on his website at www.heuse.com/free.html, and considering many people nowadays have a presence at least somewhere online that they can post a link to, I imagine anyone who really wants the full version of this game can find a way to get a copy. All that said though, the shareware version is still readily available from many websites, usually by its other name, Dungeon Rogue, and is still 1/4 of the entire game, so it's still a good way to figure out if you want to go through all this trouble or not to get the full experience. The story for the game takes place in the year 2048, which also happens to be 2 to the power of 11, but that's irrelevant. What's not irrelevant is that a machine built inside a research lab on Jupiter has gone way out of control, and is producing massive quantities of strange, hostile creatures. Your father, being head of the research lab, gets in contact with you and asks you to descend into the planet to retrieve a powerful weapon that was left behind during the evacuation, then to return and put an end to the machine itself. The shareware version of the game ends after you recover the weapon at 150 meters beneath the surface, and even lets you save once you're back on the surface so you can continue from where you left off as soon as you register the game. In the registered version, you continue down all the way to 650 meters to destroy the machine itself. To put that in perspective, there's one level every 10 meters. Yeah, this is a long game. Now, first and foremost, the gameplay is unlike virtually every other dungeon crawl ever created, especially considering this is more of an action experience as opposed to a role-playing experience. You start off really underpowered with a very weak melee weapon, a bioscanner device for learning about the various living organisms you come across, and a selection of cells. Your goal in each level is to find and tag the drop shaft to stop it from jumping around to random locations, then continue downwards through the drop shaft as soon as you feel ready, usually after defeating all of the enemies. Most important to your survival though are your cells, and they come in 3 varieties: energy, oxygen, and health. Health cells are pretty obvious. If you run out, you die. Oxygen cells are consumed every time you move, and the rate at which you lose oxygen can be improved later on. If you run out of oxygen, health is consumed instead. While this might seem sort of trivial at first, keep in mind that health cells are 5 times more expensive to replenish than oxygen cells. Lastly, your energy cells are used to power your weapons and devices. Run out of energy and you will suddenly find yourself very helpless. Thankfully, there's a variety of ways you can keep your cell counts high. First and foremost are cell plants. As you travel around the dungeons, you'll find these gray plants which start as a simple sprout, then grow relatively huge, and eventually change color, after which they can be harvested to restore a number of cells based on the color it turned. If a cell plant stays fully grown for too long though, it'll decay back down and can still be harvested if you so desire, but you'll get far fewer cells out of it than before. Leave it alone a little longer and it will once again revert back to its sprouting stage and will eventually grow into a completely new cell plant. The full cycle takes 1,250 turns, and it's about 250 turns for each stage of its development. The other ways to replenish cells are through various items that you come across, purchasing cells from the various shops, or using cell vents. The cell vents are interesting and initially only come in one variety, oxygen cell vents. Stepping on one of these converts a single point of health into a large number of oxygen cells. Under ideal circumstances, vents are actually more efficient than buying cells directly from a shop, but every turn you spend using a vent could damage it, and once damaged, you won't be able to convert any more cells with it. A little later in, you start seeing energy cell vents, which convert health to energy, and much further in, you'll actually start to find health cell vents, which convert a quantity of oxygen into health, and are actually terribly inefficient compared to buying health cells. But by the time you start seeing these, you should already have a ridiculous amount of oxygen anyways. Speaking of the shops, these are essential to survival. The shops come in three forms: weapon shops, device shops, and magic shops. Weapons devices are fairly obvious, though the magic shops sell mapping crystals, magic mushrooms, and a wizard special, as it's called, which will have a very unusual and sometimes beneficial effect for the rest of the level, such as cutting your oxygen usage in half, making cell plants grow twice as fast. There's even a wizard special that completely removes all of the walls from the level. Yeah, that one really is as weird as it sounds. One of the first things you'll notice in any store is that virtually everything you can buy or sell has two values listed: normal and current prices. The current prices of everything fluctuate within a particular range, but generally speaking, the normal prices are the middle prices. So you'll want to avoid buying cells and upgrades if they're too expensive, and you'll also want to avoid selling off particular ores and diamonds for credits if the selling price for them is too low. Anyways, let's talk about the weapons and devices, because these are the things that are ultimately going to keep you alive, and each one has a set of numbers listed. And each weapon and device has a percentage listed next to it indicating how skilled you are with it. Until these percentages are 100%, there's always a chance that your attempt to use a particular weapon or a device will fail. While you can spend money or raw crystals to bring these percentages up, you'll also gain skill with weapons and devices simply by using them. So once the percentages are high enough, spending money or raw crystals is just a waste. As for the rest of the numbers, weapons have 4, which in order from left to right indicate the range of the weapon, the minimum amount of damage it can deal, the maximum amount of damage it can deal, and the number of energy cells it burns every time you use it. For devices, there's 3 numbers. The first number is the amount of charges stored, the second number is the amount of charges you get each time you recharge, and the third number is the amount of energy burned when you perform a recharge. Though if you recharge multiple times in a row, you'll get discounts on the amount of energy used. Actually using a weapon or a device is somewhat interesting. To use a weapon, you hold the control key down and press the direction you want to attack in. To use a device, you hold the shift key instead, though devices which don't need to be aimed have you press the enter key instead of a direction when you use them. It's also important to note that while almost every weapon and device requires a turn to use, the bioscanner doesn't, and you also don't waste a turn from changing to different weapons and devices or from recharging a device. One of the more interesting things you're going to be able to do as you progress is improve a variety of special stats you have using raw crystals. The raw crystals can only be obtained in one of 3 ways: defeating enemies, finding them loose along the ground, or by random chance from special bonuses you get when you defeat every last enemy in the level. You can essentially use raw crystals to improve your skill with each of your weapons and devices, your ability to resist various kinds of attacks, your ability to deal damage, your ability to extract cells from cell plants, the speed at which you move relative to all the other enemies, the amount of oxygen you consume as you move, and how far you can see in each of the 4 cardinal directions. Finally, to help you survive, you'll come across a selection of mapping orbs and magic mushrooms. The mapping orbs are used to highlight various things on the map screen, while the magic mushrooms provide you with special capabilities, most of which are time limited, though by eating multiple mushrooms of the same kind in a row, the effects will last for longer. Now, as I said before, the difficulty is inverted, so the further you get in this game, the easier everything gets. But for the first few levels, you need to be very cautious, and I have quite a number of tips and strategies to help out new players. First and foremost, be absolutely certain you defeat every enemy on a level before moving on, because the bonuses you get for doing so can be incredibly helpful. To that end, you can use the green creature orbs to check your map to find any that you've missed, but you'll undoubtedly find out the hard way that the levels themselves are not contiguous, and that more often than not, enemies will end up in parts of the dungeon that simply cannot be accessed by traditional means. Not too many levels in, you'll have lots of options for getting into these sections, but early on, you're going to need to abuse a sequence of saving your game, eating a teleportation mushroom, hoping for the best, and reloading if you didn't hope hard enough. Fortunately, you should start encountering wall walking mushrooms once you're down to 30 meters, which will eliminate having to do this. Or if you're extremely lucky, your first 2 levels will only have enemies in fully connected areas, and you won't have to worry about doing this. And speaking of the bonuses themselves, I tend to recommend going straight for the raw crystals if you happen to be offered any, since they're the only thing offered short of money which can't be bought on your own accord. And getting your stats upgraded early on can really help you out in the long run. If raw crystals aren't offered, then go for whichever bonus would be the hardest to acquire compared to the number of credits you're being offered. Or if none of the bonuses appeal to you, just go for the credits. As far as improving your stats, I tend to recommend improving your oxygen performance by 1 step as soon as possible. Then improve your damage rate by just 1%, since this will add a single point of damage to every weapon you use. Then go for visual mapping in all 4 directions. This does take quite a number of raw crystals, but once you can see a distance of 2 spaces in every direction, it'll feel like a huge weight has been lifted off the game, and you'll be able to fully explore different sections without wasting nearly as much oxygen. Once you have some visual mapping going, that's when it's time to start saving up for your first speed upgrade, because the tactic of attacking and backing off when up against slower enemies works extremely well, and saves you tons of health cells in the long run. As for the defensive upgrades, I pretty much avoid them early on because they're not worth the crystals, and later on you're going to be using ranged weapons for the most part anyways, and none of the enemies in this game even have a ranged attack. Though speaking of oxygen usage, you need to be extremely careful about how you map the dungeons out in order to avoid needlessly wasting oxygen. For example, at the start of the game, when you can only see 1 space in all directions, you can map out huge chunks of a room by keeping in mind that you can move 3 spaces adjacent for every row or column that you scan. You can even apply some alternating diagonal moves to scan a room even faster, though I find that takes a lot more conscious effort to pull off. In short, the fewer moves you make, the less oxygen you consume, which helps you save up money for more important things. As for the weapons and devices, one of the first devices you should pick up if you can is the Biosleeper. It puts all enemies to sleep for 10 turns, which makes it very handy for dealing with enemies that are the same speed as you or faster. Another one you want to pick up once you're ready to switch to using ranged weapons is the Power Shove, which pushes an enemy away from you, allowing you to shoot at it with impunity. Now, much later in the game, you'll probably want to pick up the Wall Remover so you can stop eating wall walking mushrooms just to get past a few tiles. But in terms of weapons, keep your fingers crossed that you'll be able to pick up the Hyper Blade at 40 meters, otherwise you may be in for a very rough trip. Beyond that, your choice of weapons really doesn't make too big a difference, but you'll want to switch to using ranged weapons as soon as you've got the money to buy a good one, i.e. not the Tracer Shot. Beyond all that, at 150 meters, you're going to be face to face with a gauntlet of sorts before you can pick up the special weapon. Getting through this gauntlet is very tricky if you're not prepared. For one thing, you will need the Biosleeper, or at least 5 defense self mushrooms so you can make yourself practically immune to every kind of attack. You'll also need a couple Doorwalker mushrooms and lots of health cells. The special weapon itself is called the Oxide Rifle and is the only weapon that uses oxygen as opposed to energy, which, believe it or not, is actually a good thing. Using the Oxide Rifle when your energy levels are low is an essential tactic to staying alive, especially since as you get further down into the planet, you're probably going to stop looking at your oxygen and health levels entirely because they'll be too high for you to care about. As long as you make an effort to keep your energy and your health equally balanced, you should be okay. As for the final section of the game, be absolutely certain you have at least 1 Death Touch mushroom on you, because as far as I can tell, it's the only way to destroy the machine that's causing this disaster to begin with. Yeah, and if you happen to be playing extremely well and have your numbers up to insane levels, try not to let any of them wrap over the number of digits that their counters support. I managed to crash the game by exceeding quintuple 9 oxygen. Anyways, that's basically all I've got to say about this game. It's brutally difficult to start and has a lot of random chance thrown in, but the further you get, the easier it becomes. Practically to the point of being too easy. It's hard to say what kind of person would like this game the most. It's kind of really a technical sort of game, and there's a lot of numbers involved, so really, if you have any interest at all in what you've seen so far on the screen, then it's worth at least checking out the shareware version of the game. And if you like it and are willing to go through the whole process to get the registered game for free, well, there you go. As for DOSBox settings, they're super simple. Just set cycles to max and you're good to go. The auto setting works fine too, but the loading times will be much longer than they should be, so max is definitely preferred. Yeah, nothing more to say about that. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week on episode 92, we're going to take a look at the 3D version of game, which I've already reviewed the 2D version of. Not many choices, so if you think you know which game that is, then make sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and tune in next Saturday to see how surprisingly well this transition worked. By the way, anyone have any idea what these gray stones were supposed to be about? They're nowhere in the game.